Hello everyone and welcome to the 5-minute German A2 course. In today's video, we will learn all the different connectors in A2. So connectors is a very important topic in the A2 course and you will have to use them in the A2 speaking and writing exams if you want to get good marks. So even if you don't know anything about connectors, you don't have to worry because in this video I will explain what connectors are, when do we use them, and what effect do they have on the sentence structure. And I will also give you a lot of examples with different connectors so that you don't have any problems in understanding them. So now let's not waste any time and let's get started. Now before we take a look at all the different connectors in A2, let's first see what are connectors and when do we use them. So connectors are words which link or connect two words, phrases or sentences. And we use them to make longer and more complex sentences. So we have already seen different examples of connectors in A1. These are und, which means and, oder, which means or, and aber, which means but. So these are all examples of connectors. So an example sentence with aber can be Es ist kalt, aber die Sonne scheint. Now in this sentence, we have connected two sentences. Sentence number 1 is Es ist kalt and sentence number 2 is Die Sonne scheint. And we have connected them using aber, which shows contrast between the two sentences. And the grammatical term for connectors is conjunction or Konjunktion as it is called in German. So if you hear the word conjunction, then it also means connector. Now let's take a look at the connectors in A2. So in A2, we have a total of 10 connectors. These are weil, which means because, denn, which also means because, das, which means that, ob, which means whether or if, W-fragen, which are the W questions, can also be used as connectors, and we will see how we can do that later. Then we have als, which means when. Then we have wenn, which means when or if. The next is falls, which means in case. Then we have and zu, which means in order to. And the last one is damit, which means so that. So these are the 10 connectors which are part of the A2 course. And these are extremely important because if you are giving the A2 exam, you have to use them in the writing and speaking parts if you want to get good marks. So that's why it is important that you understand what they mean and how you can use them. So now let's start with the first connector, which is weil, and it means because in English. Now we use weil to give a reason for an action. Let's understand this with an example. So suppose we have the sentence Ich lerne Deutsch, which means I am learning German. And we have another sentence which is Ich lebe in Deutschland. I live in Germany. So now let's combine them together. So I have only given the English translation over here so that you can first understand when we use weil or because. So when we combine the two sentences with because, then the new sentence will be I am learning German because I live in Germany. And you see, the second part of the sentence gives us the reason for learning German. Let's take another example. So we have the sentences geht ins Bett, he is going to bed, and ist müde, he is tired. So when we combine them with because, then the new sentence will be he is going to bed because he is tired. And you see that the second part of the sentence with because gives the reason for going to bed. So these are the situations in which you will use weil or because. Now let's take a look at the sentence structure of weil. So over here we have the normal sentences which are Ich lerne Deutsch and Ich lebe in Deutschland. Now when we connect them together with weil, then the new sentence will be Ich lerne Deutsch, weil ich in Deutschland lebe. I am learning German because I live in Germany. Now if you take a look at this sentence, then you see that the first part of the sentence has no change and we use it as it is. Now if we take a look at the second sentence, which is Ich lebe in Deutschland, then you see that in the original sentence, the verb was also at second position. But when we connected the two sentences using weil, then the verb goes to the last position. So this is a very important point that you have to keep in mind when you use weil, and that is that weil shifts the verb at the second position to the end of the sentence. And when you connect two sentences using weil, then you also have to add a comma before weil. Now let's take a look at another example. So we have the sentence geht ins Bett and ist müde. So when we connect them using weil, then the sentence will be geht ins Bett, weil müde ist. He is going to bed because he is tired. Now over here, you see again that in the first part, there is no change. So the verb remains at the same position. However, in the second sentence, which is ist müde, the verb goes to the last position. And this is because we have used weil, which shifts the verb at second position to the end of the sentence. And we have also added a comma before weil, or between the two sentences. Let's take one more example. So we have the sentence Ich komme heute nicht, weil ich krank bin. I will not come today because I am sick. And you see over here in the second sentence, we have placed the verb at the last position. Now one more important point about these sentences is that the first part of these sentences is called the Hauptsatz in German. And a Hauptsatz is a sentence in which the verb comes at second position. Or it can also come at first position in case of questions, such as ja, nein fragen. And the second part of these sentences, which contains weil, is called the Nebensatz. And a Nebensatz is a sentence in which the verb goes to the end or the last position. And one more thing to keep in mind is that a Nebensatz cannot come alone. It can only come with a Hauptsatz. So this is the main difference between a Hauptsatz and a Nebensatz. And as we have used weil over here, so we can say that weil connects a Hauptsatz with a Nebensatz. So weil can also be called as a Nebensatz connector. And one more important thing to know is that weil always comes at the start of the Nebensatz. So any sentence which starts with weil will be a Nebensatz. Now let's take a look at a few more examples with weil. So suppose somebody asks you the question, Warum studierst du Mathematik? Why are you studying mathematics? Now since they are asking you for a reason, that's why you can answer this question with weil. And you can say, Ich studiere Mathematik, weil ich es interessant finde. I study mathematics because I find it interesting. And you see that in this answer, the verb goes to the last position. And this is because whenever we use weil, it shifts the verb at second position to the end of the sentence. So you see that we can use weil to answer questions which start with warum. Now there is another shorter way to answer this question as well, and we can simply say weil ich es interessant finde, because I find it interesting. Now let's take a look at how we can use weil with modal verbs. So here are the different modal verbs that we have in German. Now when we use weil with modal verbs, then the modal verb at second position goes to the end of the sentence. So let's take an example. So we have a sentence over here without weil, which is Ich muss morgen früh aufstehen. I must get up early tomorrow. Now in this sentence, we have the modal verb at position number 2. So when we write this sentence with weil, then it will be Ich gehe früh ins Bett, weil ich morgen früh aufstehen muss. I am going early in bed because I must get up early tomorrow. And you see in this sentence, the modal verb, which was muss, has gone to the last position. And the verb in infinitive form comes at the second last position. So this is how you can use modal verbs with weil. Now let's take a look at how we can use weil with trennbare verbs, which are separable verbs. And in this case, the second position, base verb, goes to the end of the sentence in combined form. Now let's understand this with an example. And we will take the trennbare verb aufstehen, which means to get up. So a sentence without weil will be Ich stehe früh auf. I get up early. Now in this sentence, you see that the base verb comes at the second position and the prefix comes at the last position. Now when we write the same sentence with weil, then it will be Ich gehe früh ins Bett, weil ich früh aufstehe. I go to bed early because I wake up early. And in this sentence you see that the base verb goes to the end or last position in combined form. So this is how you can use while with trennbare verbs. Then we have one more type, which is the perfect form. So if we use while with the perfect form, then in this case, the helping verb, which is sein or haben at second position, goes to the end of the sentence. So here we have an example of a sentence in perfect form without while, which is Thomas hat gestern gearbeitet. Thomas worked yesterday. So you see at position number 2, we have the helping verb. And when we write this with while, then it will be Thomas hat heute frei, weil gestern gearbeitet hat. Thomas has off today because he worked yesterday. And in this sentence, you see that the helping verb goes to the last position in conjugated form. So this is how you can use while with the perfect form. Now in the examples that we have seen up till now, the Hauptsatz came first and the Nebensatz came after it. But we can also write this sentence in another way, and that is that the Nebensatz comes before the Hauptsatz. So the sentence Ich lerne Deutsch, weil ich in Deutschland lebe can also be written as Weil ich in Deutschland lebe, lerne ich Deutsch. So you see in this case, the Nebensatz comes at the start and the Hauptsatz comes after it. And this also follows the same rule that in the Nebensatz, the verb comes at the last position. However, there's an important point that you have to keep in mind, and that is when the Hauptsatz comes after the Nebensatz or after the comma, then it will start with the verb as you see over here. Let's take a look at another example. So we have the sentence, Weil ich krank bin, komme ich heute nicht. Because I am sick, I will not come today. So over here again, in the Nebensatz, which starts with weil, we have the verb at last position, and the Hauptsatz, which comes after it, starts with the verb. So this is something that you should keep in mind so that you don't make a mistake. So before we go to the next connector, there are two important points related to while which you should keep in mind when you use it. The first is that while shifts the verb at second position to the end of the sentence, and the second is that the Hauptsatz starts with a verb if it comes after a Nebensatz. So remember these 2 points whenever you use while. So this was the connector while. Now let's take a look at the second connector, which is then. Now in English, then can be translated as because. And this is the translation which you will usually find in the dictionary. Now we can also translate then in another way, which is and the reason is that. And I personally find this translation easier for understanding the concept of then. So we will use this translation in our examples. And we will see how this is different from while. So let's take a look at the sentence structure of then. So suppose we have the sentences Ich lerne Deutsch and Ich wohne in Deutschland. And in both of these sentences, the verb is at the second position and we can connect them with then. So when we connect these two sentences, then the sentence will be Ich lerne Deutsch, then Ich wohne in Deutschland. Now when you take a look at this sentence, then you see that the first part of the sentence, which was Ich lerne Deutsch, remains as it is and there is no change. And we also have the comma between the two sentences. However, in the second sentence, we see that the verb remains at second position and it does not go to the last position as we saw earlier with while. So this is an important rule that you have to keep in mind, that whenever you use then to connect two sentences, the position of second place verb does not change. Let's take a look at another example. So we have the sentence geht ins Bett, then ist müde. He is going to bed and the reason is that he is tired. Now in this sentence, again you see that the verb remains at second position. So this is an important difference between then and while. Now if we take a look at both of these sentences, then we see that the first part is the Hauptsatz because the verb is at the second position. And in the second part, the verb is also at the second position. So this is also the Hauptsatz and not the Nebensatz. So this means that then connects a Hauptsatz with another Hauptsatz. and it can be called as a Hauptsatz connector. And in grammatical terms, we can say that then is a coordinating conjunction similar to und, oder, aber, etc. Now let's take a look at a few more examples with then, keeping the rule in mind that the position of second place verb will not change. So an example with trennbare Verben will be Ich gehe früh ins Bett, denn ich stehe früh auf. I go early in bed, and the reason is that I wake up early. Now in this case you see that the base verb remains at the second position and the prefix remains at the last position. So it does not go to the end in combined form. An example with the Modalverben will be Ich gehe früh ins Bett, denn ich muss morgen früh aufstehen. I am going early in bed, and the reason is that I must get up early tomorrow. Now over here you also see that the modal verb, which is muss, remains at second position. And the same will be the case with perfect. So we have the sentence Thomas hat heute frei, denn hat gestern gearbeitet. Thomas has off today, and the reason is that he worked yesterday. Over here again you see that the helping verb remains at second position and does not go to the end. Now one important point that you have to keep in mind when you use then is that then cannot come at the start. So this means that the sentence denn ich wohne in Deutschland, lerne ich Deutsch is incorrect, and this is why I gave you the second translation, which was and the reason is that, because when you translate it into English, then you will see that it makes no sense and it simply sounds wrong, and that's why then cannot come at the start. So now let's do a side-by-side comparison between while and then. So while can be translated as because, and then can be translated as because, or there's another translation which is and the reason is that. In case of while, the verb goes to the last position, whereas in case of then, the verb position does not change, so it remains at the second position. A sentence with while can come at the start, whereas a sentence with then cannot come at the start. And while is more commonly used in daily life, whereas then is used mostly in formal writing. So this is the difference between the two. Now my personal suggestion for you guys will be that in daily life, use while only. There's no need to use then, and while is enough. But if you are in the writing exam, you can use both while and then to avoid repetition. Otherwise, as I said, in daily life, you only need while. So this was the connector then. The next connector is thus, which means that, and it is used to explain something or give more detail about what someone thinks, says, or feels. So let's take a look at an example with thus. So we have the sentences hat gesagt, which means he said, and ist krank, he is ill. So when we combine these two using thus, then the sentence will be hat gesagt, dass krank ist. He said that he is ill. And you see that the second part of the sentence with thus gives us more detail about what he said. And another important point over here is that when we use thus, then the verb at second position goes to the end of the sentence, which is the last position. And this is the same as we saw with while. So we can say that thus shifts the verb at second position to the end of the sentence. Now let's take a look at a few more examples with thus. So we have the sentence Ich denke, dass nicht kommt. I think that he will not come. Now over here you also see that the verb goes to the last position when we use thus. Another example can be Wir wissen, dass sie bei Siemens arbeitet. We know that she works at Siemens. In this sentence as well, the verb which was arbeitet goes to the last position. So this is similar to what we learned for while. Now in all of these sentences, the first part of the sentence is the Hauptsatz or Hauptsätze, which is a plural because the verb is at the second position, and the second part with thus are the Nebensätze because in these the verb goes to the end. So we see that thus also connects a Hauptsatz with a Nebensatz. And we can say that thus is also a Nebensatz connector. And similar to while, thus always comes at the start of the Nebensatz. Now we can also use thus to explain images. So suppose we have this graph over here, and this graph shows the Handy-Nutzung pro Tag, which is mobile usage per day. And on the left, we have the Stunden pro Tag, which are the hours per day. And the first bar shows the mobile usage per day for Kinder, which are children. The second is for Berufstätige, which are employed people. And the third is for Studierende, which are students. Now I can explain this image by saying, Die Grafik zeigt, dass Kinder das Handy 2 Stunden pro Tag nutzen. The graphic shows that children use the mobile 2 hours per day. So you see that we have used thus to explain this graphic. And the first part of this sentence is an example phrase which you can use if you want to explain any other image as well. Let's take another example with the same image. So I can say, Man kann sehen, dass Studierende das Handy am meisten nutzen. One can see that students use the mobile the most. So again you see how we have used thus with this example phrase to explain the image. So this is another use of thus, which will be helpful for you whenever you want to explain any image or any picture, graph, etc. Now let's take a look at how we can use thus with modal verbs. So in this case, the rule is also similar to while, and that is that the modal verb at second position goes to the end of the sentence. So suppose we have the sentence, Ich kann heute nicht arbeiten. I cannot work today, in which the modal verb is at second position. So when we write this sentence with thus, then it will be Ich denke, dass ich heute nicht arbeiten kann. I think that I cannot work today. And in this sentence you see that the modal verb has been shifted to the last position because we have used thus. Now in case of trend-barrier verbs, the rule is also the same, which is that the base verb at second position goes to the end of the sentence in combined form. So we have the trend-barrier verb anrufen, which means to call. So a normal sentence with anrufen will be Sie ruft mich morgen an. She will call me tomorrow. And over here you see that the base verb is at the second position and the prefix is at the last position. Now when we write this sentence with thus, then it will be Ich hoffe, dass sie mich morgen anruft. I hope that she calls me tomorrow. And you see over here the trend-barrier verb or the base verb has gone to the last position in combined form. Now let's take an example with the perfect form. Now in this case the rule is also similar to while, which is that the helping verb sein or haben at second position goes to the end of the sentence. So for example, in the sentence Du hast das Fenster aufgemacht, you opened the window, we have the helping verb at position 2. And when we write the sentence with thus, it will be Ich sehe, dass du das Fenster aufgemacht hast. I see that you opened the window. And in this sentence, you see that the helping verb goes to the last position. Now in the examples that we have seen until now, we always had the Hauptsatz at the start and the Nebensatz came after it. However, similar to while, the Nebensatz can also come before the Hauptsatz when we use thus. So for example, the sentence above can be written as Dass sie bei Siemens arbeitet, wissen wir. That she works at Siemens, we know. Now over here you see that the Nebensatz comes at the start and the Hauptsatz comes after it. So this structure is also acceptable, but it is not commonly used. So that's why my suggestion would be that it is better to avoid using thus at the start. Now let's take a look at a few phrases after which you normally use thus. So these are Die Grafik or das Bild zeigt, the graphic or the image shows. Ich denke, I think. Glaubt, he believes. Wir wissen, we know. Sie möchte, she would like to. Mir gefällt nicht, I don't like. Now an example with this phrase can be Mir gefällt nicht, dass du rauchst. I don't like that you smoke. And another phrase can be Es ist wichtig, it is important. And an example with this can be Es ist wichtig, dass du Mathematik studierst. It is important that you study mathematics. So these are some common phrases after which you normally use thus. And one more thing to keep in mind is that the personal pronouns which I have used in all of these phrases can be different. So you can also change them when you use them in a sentence. So the important rule which we have learned when using thus is that thus shifts the verb at second position to the end of the sentence. And this is similar to while. So this was thus. Now before we go to the next connector, let's categorize these connectors in a different way based on what we have learned until now. So we can group these connectors in two categories. One are the connectors in which the verb at second position goes to the end, and the second are the connectors in which the verb position does not change. Now from the connectors that we have learned, we know that while is a connector in which the verb at second position goes to the end, and thus is a connector which also shifts the verb at second position to the last position. Whereas then is a connector which does not change the position of the verb. So the verb remains at second position when we use then. And the interesting thing is that all the other connectors that we have, such as ob, W-fragen, als, wenn, falls, so, and damit, all these connectors shift the verb at second position to the end of the sentence. And these can also be called Nebensatz connectors. So with this information, it will be easier for you to create sentences with the correct sentence structure, because you will know that whenever you use these connectors on the left, you have to shift the verb at second position to the end of the sentence. Now let's go to the next connector, which is ob, which means whether or if in English. Now let's first take a look at when to use ob. So ob is used in two conditions. The first is when we want to ask a Ja-Nein-Frage or Ja-Nein question in an indirect way, and the second is to show uncertainty. For example, when we are not sure about something. So we will take a look at both of these cases one by one. So let's start by taking a look at how to ask Ja-Nein questions with ob in an indirect way. But in order to understand that, let's first take a look at what are direct questions or direkte Fragen and what are indirect questions or indirekte Fragen. So let's compare them side by side. So an example of a direct question can be, is the doctor available? Now this is a more direct way to ask a question. And it is possible that in some cases, if you ask this question, the other person might get angry. Now let's see how we can ask the same question in an indirect way. We will say, I would like to ask if the doctor is available. Now you see that this is a more polite and formal way to ask a question. And when you ask a question like this, it is possible that the other person will be more willing to help you. So this is a difference between direct questions and indirect questions. In A1, we have already learned direct questions, and in A2, the focus is more on indirect questions. Now let's take a look at the sentence structure when we use the connector ob. So in order to understand this, we will do a comparison between a direct question and an indirect question with ob. So a direct question can be, Ist es heiß draußen? Is it hot outside? Now since this is a Ja-Nein-Frage, that's why you see that we have the verb at position number 1. Now if we ask the same question in an indirect way with ob, then it will be, Ich möchte fragen, ob es draußen heiß ist. I would like to ask whether or if it is hot outside. Now you see that we start this indirect question with an introductory sentence. And this can also be considered as the Hauptsatz. And in the second part, since we have used ob, that's why the verb goes to the last position. Let's take another example. So I have the question, hat der Zug Verspätung? Is the train delayed? So Verspätung means delay. Now if we ask the same question with ob, it will be, Ich möchte wissen, ob der Zug Verspätung hat. I would like to know whether or if the train is delayed. And in this sentence, again, we have the introductory sentence at the start, which is Ich möchte wissen, which is also the Hauptsatz, and the verb hat goes to the last position. Now let's take a look at one more example. So we have the sentence, Können Sie mir sagen, ob Sie eine Uhr haben? Can you tell me whether or if you have a watch? So this also follows the same pattern, and the verb haben comes at the last position. And since in all of these sentences with ob, the verb goes to the end, that's why these are called Nebensätze. So this is how you can use ob to ask Ja-Nein questions in an indirect way. Now let's take a look at how we can use ob for showing uncertainty. That is, using ob when you are not sure about something. So for this, let's take a look at the example. Ich weiß nicht, ob Zeit hat. I don't know whether or if he has time. Now this statement over here is not a question. Rather, it shows uncertainty, that I don't know whether he has time or not. Now we can also use ob at the start when we want to show uncertainty. Now the example above can be rewritten as, Ob Zeit hat, weiß ich nicht. Whether or if he has time, I don't know. And you see in this case we have the Nebensatz before the Hauptsatz. So from this example you see that whenever we want to express uncertainty, we can also use ob at the start. But remember that ob will not come at the start for indirect questions. So when you have a question, then the Hauptsatz will come first and the Nebensatz with ob will come after it. So I hope that this is clear. Now let's take a look at some phrases which show uncertainty. So whenever you see such a phrase, you know that you can use ob after it. So the first phrase is Ich weiß nicht, which means I don't know. And we already saw an example for this, which was Ich weiß nicht, ob Zeit hat. I don't know whether or if he has time. Then we have Ich frage mich, which means I wonder. And an example with this will be Ich frage mich, ob sie heute kommt. I wonder whether or if she will come today. Then we have another phrase which is Ich bin nicht sicher, I am not sure. And an example can be Ich bin nicht sicher, ob mit dem Zug fährt. I am not sure whether or if he will travel with the train. So these are different phrases after which you can use ob. And remember that the personal pronouns that I have used over here can be different depending on who the subject is. Now let's take a look at some examples with ob with trennbare Verben, Modalverben and perfect form. And remember the rule that verb at second position will go to the end when we use ob. So an example with a trennbare verb can be Sie fragt, ob der Bus pünktlich ankommt. She asks whether or if the bus will arrive on time. And in this case you see that the trennbare verb has gone to the last position in the combined form. In case of Modalverben, we have the sentence Ich weiß nicht, ob heute arbeiten muss. I don't know whether or if he has to work today. So you see the modal verb goes to the last position. And in case of perfect, we have the question Kannst du mir sagen, ob Anna schon nach Hause gegangen ist? Can you tell me whether or if Anna has already gone home? So you see that the helping verb, which is ist in this case, has gone to the last position. Now you might have a question that when do we use a question mark? Now if we have the question over here, which is Können Sie mir sagen, ob Sie eine Uhr haben? Now in this case we have used a question mark at the end because we are asking a question. So that's why it makes sense to use a question mark. On the other hand, if we take a look at the example Ich möchte wissen, ob der Zug Verspätung hat. In this case, we have not used a question mark at the end. Rather, we have used a full stop. This is because this is not a question. Rather, it is a statement. So the tip from my side is that you use the question mark when you are asking a question and you use a full stop when ob is used to express a statement or showing uncertainty. Now let's take a look at some cases where we will not use ob. So we know that ob can be translated as whether or if, but it does not replace if in every situation. And we will not use ob in case of conditional sentences. Rather, we will use the other connectors such as when or false, which we will take a look at later. So suppose we have the sentence, I will call you if I have time. So this is an example of a conditional sentence that I will call the other person if I have time. Now if I write this with ob, then it will be Ich rufe dich, ob ich Zeit habe, which can be translated as I will call you whether I have time. But this is incorrect because, as I told you, that we will not use ob with conditional sentences. Now let me give you a tip on how you can recognize whether you can use ob or not. So the tip is that you should add or not at the end of the sentence. And if it makes sense, then use ob, else don't use it. So let's understand this with an example. So I take the example from earlier, which was I will call you if I have time. Now if I add or not at the end, then the sentence will be I will call you if I have time or not. Now this sentence does not make sense because I should know whether I will have time or not. So that's why this sentence is incorrect and I will not use ob in this case. Now let's take a look at another example. So I have the sentence I would like to know if the train is delayed. Now if I add or not at the end of this sentence, it will be I would like to know if the train is delayed or not. Now this is a sentence which makes sense because it is possible that the train is delayed or not delayed. That's why this sentence is correct and you can use ob in this case. And in German, this sentence will be Ich möchte wissen, ob der Zug Verspätung hat. So just keep this in mind whenever you are thinking of using ob in a sentence. So this was the connector ob. Now let's take a look at the next connector, which are W-fragen, and these can also be used as connectors for indirect questions. So we have already seen the important W-fragen in A1. Now let's see how we can make indirect W-fragen, in which the W word is used as a connector. So a direct W question can be was machst du, which means what are you doing. Now I can ask the same question in an indirect way by saying ich möchte wissen, was du machst. I would like to know what you are doing. Now you see, in this case, we have again used an introductory sentence at the start, which is ich möchte wissen, and when the W word is used as a connector, then the verb at second position goes to the end, similar to the other connectors that we saw earlier. Let's take a look at another question. So we have the direct W question, which is wann soll ich vorbeikommen? When should I come by? And when we ask this in an indirect way, then it will be kannst du mir sagen, wann ich vorbeikommen soll? Can you tell me when should I come by? So again, we have the introductory sentence at the start, and the verb, which is a modal verb in this case, goes to the last position. Now let's take one last example. So I have the direct question, which is welches Auto hat Thomas gekauft? Which car did Thomas buy? Now I can make an indirect W question or statement by saying ich weiß nicht, welches Auto Thomas gekauft hat. I don't know which car Thomas bought. Now in this case, since we have ich weiß nicht at the start, that's why this is not a question, rather this statement shows uncertainty. That's why we have a full stop at the end, and since the question was in the perfect form, that's why the helping verb at second position goes to the end. So this is how you can use W-fragen as connectors. Now let's go to the next connector, which is als, which means when. Now als is a word which has different uses and also different meanings. So the first use of als is for comparison or for making the comparative form. And when it is used for comparison, it means then. So an example for this can be mein Auto ist schneller als dein Auto. My car is faster than your car. Another use is to indicate a function or role, and in this case it means as. So an example can be ich arbeite als Ingenieur bei Siemens. I work as an engineer at Siemens. And the third use is as a connector, and in this case it means when. Now we have already learned the first and second use in the A1 course, and now we will learn how als can be used as a connector. Now als as a connector is used to talk about a one-time event which happened in the past, which is die Vergangenheit in German. So let's understand this with an example. So I have the sentence Julia hat geheiratet, als sie 22 war. Julia married when she was 22 or 22 years old. Now this sentence describes a one-time event which happened in the past, because Julia was 22 only once, and that's why we have used als. And you see that als also shifts the verb to the last position. Now there is one more important point over here, and that is you see that the verb at the last position is in preteritum or the past tense. And in the first part we have used the perfect form, and both of these represent the past tense. Now since als is used to talk about a one-time event which happened in the past, that's why it can only be used with the past tense, such as preteritum, perfect, etc. You will not use the present tense with als. So this is important to remember. Now we can also write this sentence in another way, and that is that the Nebensatz comes before the Hauptsatz. So the sentence will be als Julia 22 war, hat sie geheiratet. When Julia was 22, she married. Now you see that the Hauptsatz in the first sentence has gone after the comma, and the Nebensatz, which was als sie 22 war, has gone to the start. And I hope that you remember the rule from earlier, which is that when the Hauptsatz comes after the comma or after the Nebensatz, then it must start with the verb. Now let's take a look at another example. So I have the sentence als ich 5 war, musste ich in die Schule gehen. When I was 5, I had to go to school. Now over here you again see that we have used the modal verb in preteritum, and the main verb goes to the last position in infinitive form, and in the first part we have also used war, which is the preteritum form. Let's take another example. So I have the sentence Thomas konnte schon lesen, als im Kindergarten war. Thomas could already read when he was in kindergarten. So again you see that the verb war, which is in preteritum, goes to the last position, and in the first part we have used the modal verb können in preteritum. So this was the connector als. Now let's take a look at the next connector, which is when. Now this has two meanings. The first is when, and this is used for time, similar to else, and the second is if, and this is used for conditional sentences. Now let's first take a look at sentences where when means when. Now as you know that else also means when. So how do we know when to use when and when to use else? So whenever you are talking about the Vergangenheit, which is the past, and it is a one-time event that you are describing, then you will use else. But if you are talking about a past and the event which you are describing is a repeated event, then you will use when. So let's understand this with some examples. So as I said that when is used in the past for events which take place more than once. So let's take a look at some examples in the Vergangenheit. So I have an example with als over here, which we already saw. Julia hat geheiratet, als sie 22 war. So this was a one-time event. That's why we used als. Now an example with when can be, wenn wir Urlaub hatten, gingen wir zu Oma und Opa. When we had holidays, we went to the grandparents or the grandparents' house. Now this is not a one-time event because it is most likely that we went to the grandparents' house more than once. So it was a repeated event. That's why we have used when over here. And you see with when, the verb also goes to the last position in Präteritum because we are talking about the past. And the other verb, which is gingen, is the Präteritum form for the verb gehen, which means to go. Now I know that it can be difficult sometimes to identify just from the sentence whether it is a repeated event or a one-time event. So a way to recognize whether the event is a repeated event or a one-time event is that you can look for words which show repetition. And these words are immer, which means always, jedes Mal, which means each time, manchmal, which means sometime, oft, which means often, and so on. So when any of these words come in a sentence, then it means that it is a repeated event. And we will always use when with these words. So let's rewrite this sentence over here with one of the words which show repetition. So I can write this sentence as immer wenn wir Urlaub hatten, gingen wir zu Oma und Opa. Always when we had holidays, we went to the grandparents. So you see that now it is more clear that this is a repeated event. And you see that we have not changed anything else. The verbs remain at the same position. The only thing that we have done is that we have added immer at the start, which shows repetition. Let's take another example. So I have the sentence, wenn ich ins Büro ging, habe ich meinen Mitarbeiterausweis mitgenommen. When or whenever I went to office, I took my employee card with me. Now this is also a repeated event because I went to the office more than once. That's why I have used when. And you see that the second part is in perfect form where I have used the participle zwei form of the verb nehmen. Now I can rewrite this sentence with a word which shows repetition to make it more clear. So I can say, jedes Mal, wenn ich ins Büro ging, nahm ich meinen Mitarbeiterausweis mit. Each time when I went to office, I took my employee card with me. So you see the word jedes Mal shows repetition. And in this sentence, I have used nahm, which is the first person Präteritum form of the verb nehmen. So since we are talking about the past, that's why it is important to use the past forms. So if you are talking about a repeated event which happened in the past, then you will use when. And if it is a one-time event, then you will use als. Now what will you use when you are talking about the present or Gegenwart or future, which is Zukunft? So in case of the present or future, if it is a one-time event or a repeated event, you will always use when. So you see that als is only used when we are talking about a one-time event in the Vergangenheit, and for all the other cases we use when. Now let's take a look at some examples with when in the present or Gegenwart. So an example can be, ich trinke Kaffee, wenn ich müde bin. I drink coffee when I am tired. Now you see that this sentence describes a habit or a repeated event. That's why we have used when. And since this is a sentence in the present tense, that's why we have used the present form for both the verbs that we have used in this sentence. Now we can also rewrite this sentence with when at the start. So it will be wenn ich müde bin, trinke ich Kaffee. When I am tired, I drink coffee. And again you see both the verbs are in the presence. Now if you want, then in the second sentence, you can also use dann after the comma. So the sentence will be wenn ich müde bin, dann trinke ich Kaffee. When I am tired, then I drink coffee. But this is optional. So it is up to you if you want to use it or not. But I just wanted to tell you that if you see dann, you don't get confused. Now let's take a look at another example. So I have the sentence, wenn Thomas kommt, gehen wir zusammen ins Kino. When Thomas comes, we will go together to the cinema. Now this can be a single event, but since it is in the present tense, that's why we have used when. Now let's take a look at a few examples for the Zukunft or the future. So I have the sentence, wenn du nächste Woche kommst, machen wir einen Ausflug. When you come next week, we will go on a trip. Now you see that this is a single event. And as we have nächste Woche in the sentence, that's why we know that we are talking about the future. And therefore we have used when. Now another example can be, immer wenn du mich brauchst, würde ich dir helfen. Whenever you need me, I will help you. Now because we have immer in this sentence, that's why we know that this is a repeated event. And würde is a conjugation of the verb werden, which is also used for the future. So we will take a look at this in another video. But at this point, just know that one use of the verb werden is to tell about the future. So these are the different cases in which you use when to talk about time. You can also take a screenshot of this slide over here so that you don't forget. Now let's take a look at the second meaning of when, which is if, and which is used for conditional sentences. So when means if, when it is used for situations which can happen or are possible. So an example can be, wenn es regnet, bleiben wir zu Hause. If it rains, we will stay at home. Now it is possible that you saw the forecast and it did show rain. So it means that it is possible that it might rain. And that's why we have used when. And you see that the part with when describes the condition for staying at home. Now let's take a look at another example. So I have the sentence, wenn ich Deutsch lerne, kann ich in Deutschland studieren. If I learn German, I can study in Germany. Now again over here we have used when because this is the condition for studying in Germany. And I think that I can learn German. So this is possible. That's why I have used when. And you see that in this case, the verbs also go to the last position, just as we saw for the other connectors. So these are the different ways that you can use when. So you see that we can also use when for conditional sentences and especially for situations which can happen or are possible. And in this case, it means if. So this was the connector when. The next connector is falls, which means in case, and this is used for situations which might not happen or have a less chance of happening. So let's understand this with an example. So suppose that you have a friend who is arriving at the train station. And you tell him that ich hole dich morgen vom Bahnhof ab. I will pick you from the train station tomorrow. But you also tell him, falls ich keine Zeit habe, holt dich Thomas ab. In case I don't have time, Thomas will pick you. So this situation is less likely, but you still told him that as backup, if I cannot come, then Thomas will come. So that's why we have used falls over here. Let's take a look at some other examples. So suppose that you saw the forecast and it does not show any rain, but you still want to have a backup in case it rains. Then you will say, falls es regnet, kommen wir zurück nach Hause. In case it rains, we will come back home. So this means that most probably it will not rain, but if due to some reason it does, we will come back home. So that's why we have used falls. Another example can be, falls ich die Prüfung nicht bestehe, muss ich sie nochmal schreiben. In case I don't pass the exam, I will have to write it again. But there's a very less chance that I will fail. So that's why we have used falls. So let's do a side-by-side comparison. So we said that when is used for situations which can happen or are possible, and falls is used for situations which might not happen or have a less chance of happening. Now my tip for you for the A2 exam will be, that you should only use when, because this is easier and more simpler. And if you want, then use false only if you are 100% sure that it can be used. But it is better to avoid it in A2. You can or you should use it in the upper levels such as B1 or B2. But in A2, if you don't use false and only use when, that is good enough and you will get good marks. So this was false. Now let's take a look at the last two connectors side by side, which are umsu, which means in order to, and damit, which means so that. So both of these connectors are used to express a goal, intention, or purpose, and they tell why or for what purpose an action is being done. Now let's take a look at a few examples in English first so that you understand when we use umsu and damit. So I have the sentence, I am going to a language school in order to learn German. Now in this sentence, the second part describes the purpose or goal of going to a language school. Now the same sentence with damit or so that can be written as I am going to a language school so that I learn German. Now you see that this also tells us the purpose or goal of going to a language school. Now you see that both umsu and damit express a purpose or a goal. However, there is a difference in the sentence structure and subject when we use them in German. And that is what we are going to take a look at right now. But before that, let me tell you different ways in how you can ask about the purpose. Now there are different ways to ask about the purpose in German. The first is warum, which means why. So we already know this. Then we also have another W word, which is wozu, which means for what. And a third way is zu welchem Zweck, which means for which purpose. So Zweck means purpose or goal. So if you see any of these words in the question, then you can use umsu or damit in your answer. Now let's first take a look at umsu and understand it with some examples. So suppose somebody asks you the question, wozu gehst du zur Sprachschule? For what purpose do you go to the language school? Then you can answer it by saying, Ich gehe zur Sprachschule, Deutsch zu lernen. I go to a language school in order to learn German. So you see that I have used and zu to answer this question. Now let's take a look at the sentence structure. So when we analyze the second part of this sentence, then we see that this part starts with then we have some extra info, and at the end we have zu followed by the verb in infinitive form. And you also see that we don't have any subject in this part because we are talking about the same person which was mentioned at the start or in the Hauptsatz. Now let's take a look at another example. So we have the sentence, arbeitet, Geld zu verdienen. He works in order to earn money. Now you see this also follows the same structure. So in the Nebensatz, after the comma, we start with then we have some extra info, which is Geld in this case, and at the end we have zu followed by the verb in infinitive, which is verdienen, which means to earn. And you see over here, we also don't have any subject in the Nebensatz because we are talking about the same person. Let's take some more examples. So I have the sentence, Sie spart Geld, ein neues Handy zu kaufen. She is saving money in order to buy a new mobile. Now over here again you see that the Nebensatz starts with then we have some extra info or the object, which is ein neues Handy, and at the end we have zu followed by the verb in infinitive, which is kaufen. Another example can be, Ich öffne das Fenster, frische Luft zu bekommen. I open the window in order to get fresh air. Again we have followed by some extra info, which is frische Luft, which means fresh air, and at the end we have zu followed by the verb in infinitive. So this is how you can use umsu with normal verbs. Now let's take a look at how you can use umsu with trennbare verbs. So let's understand this with an example, and I will take the trennbare verb aufstehen, which means to get up, and we know that in this verb auf is the prefix and stehen is the base verb. So when I use this in a sentence with and zu, then the sentence will be Ich gehe früh ins Bett, früh aufzustehen. I go to bed early in order to wake up early. Now you see that the trennbare verb goes to the end, but there is a difference, and that is that zu is added between the prefix and the base verb. So it becomes auf zu stehen. So whenever you use zu with trennbare verbs, then the su comes between the prefix and the base verb. So if we use a trennbare verb with su, then we will have the prefix followed by su, and then we will have the base verb in infinitive. Now let's take a look at some other examples. So I will take the verb ansehen, which means to watch. So when I use this with zu, then I have the sentence: Wir gehen ins Kino, den neuen Film anzusehen. We are going to the cinema in order to watch the new film. So you see, we have added su between an and sehen. Let's take another verb, which is ausleihen, which means to borrow. And a sentence can be: Du kannst zur Bibliothek gehen, Bücher auszuleihen. You can go to the library in order to borrow books. So again you see that the su comes between aus and leihen. So between the prefix and the base verb, which is in infinitive form. So this is how you can use su with trennbare verbs. Now let's take a look at damit, and we will do this by doing a comparison with su so that it is easier for you to understand. So a sentence with su, which we already saw, was Ich gehe zur Sprachschule, Deutsch zu lernen. And you see that we have no subject over here because we are talking about the same person, and the verb goes to the end in infinitive form. Now if I want to write the same sentence with damit, then it will be Ich gehe zur Sprachschule, damit ich Deutsch lerne. I go to a language school so that I learn German. Now you see, when we write the sentence with damit, then the verb goes to the end in conjugated form and not in infinitive form. So this is one difference. And the second difference is that in the Nebensatz with damit, the subject is needed. So you see, I have mentioned the subject, which is ich, in the Nebensatz. So this is the main difference in the sentence structure between su and damit. And one more information for you guys is that sentences with su and damit are called Finalsatz. So this is the grammatical term for sentences with damit and su. And Finalsatz is also a type of Nebensatz. So if you see Finalsatz anywhere, then you should know that they are talking about sentences with su or damit. Now let's take a look at another example. So we have the sentence: Wir gehen zum Supermarkt, Eier zu kaufen. We are going to the supermarket in order to buy eggs. Now since this is a sentence with su, that's why we have no subject in the Nebensatz and the verb is in infinitive. Now the same sentence with damit will be: Wir gehen zum Supermarkt, damit wir Eier kaufen. We are going to the supermarket so that we buy eggs. Now you see over here, we have the verb in conjugated form at the end, and we have also mentioned the subject in the Nebensatz. So this is important for you to understand. Now in case of su, we said that the subject is the same, but in case of damit, the subject can be different. Now let's understand this with an example. So I have the sentence: Ich erkläre es langsam, damit du alles verstehst. I explain it slowly so that you can understand everything. Now you see that in this sentence with damit, the subject is different in the Hauptsatz and the Nebensatz. Now let's take a look at another example. So I have the sentence: kauft viel Gemüse, damit die Kinder gesund essen. He buys a lot of vegetables so that the children eat healthy. Now in this sentence, again you see that the subject in the Hauptsatz and the Nebensatz is different. So this is another important point for damit, that you can use it to talk about a different subject. Now let's see how you can use damit with trennbare verbs. And the good news is that damit is used with trennbare verbs in the same way as other connectors such as weil, thus, and so on. So we will take the trennbare verb aufstehen, and I am using the same verb and examples so that it is easier for you to understand the difference between the different connectors. So I have the sentence: Ich gehe früh ins Bett, damit ich morgen früh aufstehe. I go to bed early so that I wake up early in the morning. So you see that the conjugated trennbare verb goes to the last position in combined form. Let's take another example, this time with the verb rausgehen, which means to go out. So I have the sentence: Ich mache das Fenster auf, damit die Katze rausgeht. I open the window so that the cat can go out. Again, you see that the conjugated trend by verb goes to the last position in combined form. Now let's see how we can use umsu and damit with modal verbs. So a sentence with modal verbs and umsu can be Ich lerne Deutsch, in Deutschland arbeiten zu können. I am learning German in order to be able to work in Germany. Now you see in this case the modal verb goes to the last position in infinitive form and we have zu before it and the main verb comes before zu. And the same sentence with damit will be Ich lerne Deutsch, damit ich in Deutschland arbeiten kann. I am learning German so that I can work in Germany. Now in this case you see that the modal verb comes at the last position in conjugated form, similar to as we saw for the other connectors. Now there is one important point that you have to keep in mind with modal verbs when you use umsu and damit with modal verbs, and that is that umsu and damit are used with the modal verbs können and dürfen. With the modal verbs sollen, möchten and wollen, we cannot use umsu and damit. And müssen can be used with damit, but its use is a little bit complicated. Now to be on the safe side, my tip for you would be that the modal verbs können and dürfen are easier to use with damit as compared to umsu. So that's why I would suggest that if you are in the exam, then you use damit with the modal verbs können and dürfen. Now one more important point for umsu and damit is that we don't use the perfect form with umsu and damit in Nebensatz. This is because the perfect form is used for the past and we use umsu and damit to talk about a goal or a purpose which cannot be in the past. That's why you will not use umsu and damit with the perfect form. Now let's do a side-by-side comparison for umsu and damit so that you understand it properly. So umsu is used when the subject is the same, whereas in case of damit, the subject may or may not be the same. So the subject in the Hauptsatz and Nebensatz can be different. In case of umsu, the subject is not mentioned in the Nebensatz, whereas in case of damit, the subject must be mentioned. And when we use umsu, then the verb comes in infinitive form. So an example that we saw for this was Ich gehe zur Sprachschule, Deutsch zu lernen. So you see lernen is the infinitive form. Whereas in case of damit, the verb comes in conjugated form at the last position. And we saw this in the example Ich gehe zur Sprachschule, damit ich Deutsch lerne. So you see that we have the verb at the last position in conjugated form and we have also mentioned the subject in the Nebensatz. And with this, we have now completed all the connectors in A2. In all the connectors which are mentioned on the left hand side, the verb at second position goes to the end. And in case of umsu, the verb comes in infinitive form and not in conjugated form. And then is the only connector in which the verb position does not change. So you can take a screenshot of this slide over here as you can take a look at it before the exam to see in which connectors the verb goes to the last position so that you can use them correctly in the sentences. So these connectors are a major part of the A2 course. And now since you have learned them, you are ready to use them in the exam and get good marks. So I hope that this video was helpful for you. If you have any questions or feedback, please let me know in the comments below. Thank you very much for your time and we will see each other in the next video.